Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last lesson of 2D animation. Now, this lesson will discuss more on the tips, the details, and the other ways that can actually help you as you create your animation, not only for your summative, but hopefully for future projects as well. Let's actually start with the terminologies and concepts. Now, some terminologies are actually anachronistic. Now, when we say something is anachronistic, it means that this term is existing out of its time in history. This means that there are details from the old version of this item that's still being used in its modern or new edition or version. So first is the term footage. Now back then, when films were shot on film reels, the 24 per second measurement was still used. 16 frames of the film reel, the 35 millimeter film reel, measured to around 1 foot. Hence is the term footage. Next is the concept of animating in ones, twos, and threes. Now, when you shoot a frame, if you're animating in ones, you hold that exposure of the frame for 1 second. If you're animating in twos, you hold the exposure for 2 seconds. There is the common misconception that when you animate in twos, you animate every second frame. That's incomplete. When you animate in twos, you animate every second frame. With each instance that you have to animate again, or when you have to expose the frame again, you have to show 2 frames. Same concept with animating in threes. So you animate every 3 frame gap, and then you show 3 frames. When you animate in ones, use this when you are animating fast action and camera movements. This is because animating in ones gives a smoother result. Next, when you animate in twos, this is the animation style that you would want to use for most of your movements. Even if you want to animate in a very smooth manner, in order to save time and resource, it would be better to animate in twos. Lastly, if you want to animate smaller objects or rather slower objects, use the animating in threes style. The importance of understanding the difference between animating in ones, twos, and threes will help you save not only your time but also your resources. It is very inefficient if you will have to draw everything in once, when you could be using your time more effectively when you animate it in twos. And at the same time, if something has to be animated in a very slow motion, it would be better if you animated it in threes rather than animating in ones with very small motion increments. Last is the term dope sheet or exposure sheet or X sheet. In these sheets, the animators explain what's going on in each scene. It will explain what frames should be exposed, um, what is the purpose of the certain frame being given or being shown, and what will follow that specific frame. Now, this dope sheet gets passed down the animation pipeline. After the animator creates the dope sheet, it will be passed on to the editor or maybe to the color artist, and they will make note of the flow through the dope sheet. This dope sheet is actually the precursor to the timeline that we can see in the different animation applications. Here is a quick example of the animating in ones and twos, but let's just move on first to the dope sheets. On the left, this is an example of a filled out dope sheet. So we can see that it has details about camera movement, synchronizing of sound, the different frame numbers, the different objects that should be in the frame, and etc. Then to save up time, it followed a horizontal orientation, and it also integrated the frame number and audio, and it eventually became the timeline that we know now. So this is an example of the difference between animating in ones and twos. So as we can see, yes, animating in ones is much smoother than the rest of the two, but this will really take up your time. Given that you guys are students, you have a limited time period to work on things. Be efficient. Don't insist on making the smoothest animation there when animating in twos work well enough than animating in ones. At the same time, if you want a more bouncy feel to your drawing, to your animation rather, then animate in threes. You can use this as a guide on how to structure your frame rates. At the same time, you don't have to stick to a single animating process. You can mix around animating in twos, then shift it to animating in ones to imply a sudden smooth motion. And then you can even move it to animating in threes if you want to show them slowing down a bit or giving them a more bouncy motion. Now, this is the animation pipeline. Now, some animation companies or industries might have a different animation pipeline. Some of them might have more roles inserted in the flow. Some of them might have merged certain roles, but this is a general idea of it. It would, of course, start with a director. Once the story is made, it would get passed to the storyboard artist, and then the layout and composition, and then passed on to rigging. Now, at some point in between there can be a character designer or character animator. After the rigging of the character model, it is only then that the scene would be passed on to the animator. After the work of the animator, the cleanup or editing or checking team would then analyze the animation. Now, this isn't a linear pipeline. It's very possible that something made around the point of the rigging artist will get back to the director, and then the flow will continue, and then maybe at some point around the layout artist there will be something to be revisited or refined. It can actually lead to the cleanup pipeline or to the cleanup stage, and then go back to the storyboard and then go back to the director. So it's not really linear. And with that, one tip as a person in the animation pipeline, you should always start animating the easy scenes first. Don't animate the slow motion, very smooth scenes, action scenes. Rather start with easier scenes. Maybe divide them into huge blocks. Which scenes should be prioritized? Which scenes should be done second? And which scenes are you actually comfortable with being trashed? You have to analyze whether or not certain scenes have to stay in the story. You can't keep all of the scenes that you've made. At some point, some scenes will have to be discarded for time and resource purposes. Now we have a quote by Miguel de Cervantes: "Forewarned, forearmed. To be prepared is half the victory." The importance of this quote, at least in the field of animation, is that you have to be prepared before you actually start animating. A good animation happens because there is good preparation. That is why the preparatory sheets such as the script, the storyboard, and etc. help establish the path to finish line in your animation. If you've decided to start your storyboard in the middle of your animation, then it would be a mess. Or rather, by doing the storyboarding, you might end up realizing that there were things that you should have cleaned up. You might realize that the composition would have been better if you did this instead rather than that. But, yan nga, baka sayang na kasi maybe you're almost done with your animation. Remember, you have to be efficient with not only your time but also your efforts. Now let's do a quick review of the preparatory sheets. One of these is the model sheets. So this was actually discussed in our character design lesson. So think of this as a review. So the model sheets show the character in different angles. The model sheets also show the head heights and the construction markers to keep the proportions. Now, the model sheet is used to show animators how to draw the character in different angles. This turnaround can also help the animators visualize how this character should look. Some model sheets include quote-unquote problem shots, which are angles or perspectives that are very difficult to illustrate of this character. The different mouth positions is also included in the model sheets. Since characters are expected to talk, maybe their mouths move in a certain way. It's not to say that the different body parts are not important when it comes to managing how they move, but the mouth position is very important because the animators have to simulate the visuals that this character is speaking. In today's current animation process, model sheets now come with a rig. Now, this can either be one way to expedite the animation process, or it can also take into consideration the 3D animation process. Now, remember, we are discussing the general animation process. This isn't specifically to 2D. Some of these concepts can be applied rather in 3D. Now, there are things called pose sheets. This ties down the personality of the character through body language, which is why your drawing two lessons are important because through the model sheets, you can tell the message or you can imply the story and personality of the characters through a flat drawing. So, one tip when it comes to making your model sheets, start with gesture drawing. After doing the general gesture, once you've illustrated the quote unquote energy of your character, move on to a rough sketch and then add details along the way. Do not start immediately with a very detailed gesture drawing, or do not start with a very detailed drawing, at least for one drawing, because you might end up not having the time and energy to finish the rest of the poses with the same level of detail. So start with gesture drawing. All of them should be drawn in that way. After that, all of them should be translated into a rough sketch, and then all of them would be given more and more details. So we have an example here of a pose sheet or a model sheet. On the left, we have the model sheet of Pinocchio's head in different angles. The special poses or is another name of problem poses. So these are angles that are very particular, and some people might have difficulty illustrating this angle. On the right is or are poses of Kristoff from Frozen. So as you can see, these are the general poses, the general expressions of Kristoff to cement his character. Next is the concept of perspective and depth. Perspective and depth rely on the vanishing point. So the vanishing point is where something is way too far for our eyes to see that they eventually vanish. Now, in order to find the vanishing point, you have to establish the horizon line and the different perspective lines. These are, or rather, this concept should have been taught to you in Drawing 2. Or rather, you should have learned this concept in Drawing 2. So think of this as a review. The advantage of establishing perspective and depth in your animation is the implication of camera position. You can imply a false camera angle, false camera position by the way that you illustrate the perspective of your drawing. And with that, it can help you create a good composition and layout for your scenes. Now, not perspective is not limited to the lines and the angles. When it comes to implying perspective, also use color and dimension. So here we have the different ways to adjust the perspective. You can have a low horizon line, a mid horizon line, or even a high horizon line. Now with each angle, there has to be something consistent. If you're drawing a low horizon perspective, all of the knees will be aligned. No knees will stray away from the horizon line. And the only exception is if someone is shorter or taller. But generally speaking, people of the same height will have all of their knees aligned. As for the mid horizon, everyone um, is the same at chest level. Once again, not considering the different height. If you are drawing a child, of course, their chest level will not be the same of those of an adult. Then same with the high horizon. If you want to draw something as if you're looking down at it, then make sure all of the heads are aligned at the high horizon line. As for color and definition, so the idea of color is that the further the object is, the more saturated it, the more desaturated rather it becomes. And in definition, the further an object is, the blurrier it becomes. This is because the air in the atmosphere will eventually distort um, objects in the distance. So if you are drawing, let's say, a person wearing a red dress, the further they get from the perspective or from the camera, their red dress must look or must get desaturated. At the same time, they must get blurrier. Next is the concept of lighting in scenes. Now, tonal values, as a quick review, these are the different um, hues of white, gray, and black in your illustrations. These tonal values actually tell us when you create your scenes, have a set light tone, mid-tone, and dark areas, and then work around it. Add more tonal gradients after establishing your first three major tones. And the more tones you add, the more depth you give to your scene. So I have a example here. So first is a little tone shading guide. So as you move through the different tones, one reliable way of gradually increasing the darkness of your tones or gradually lightening up the value of your tones, move it using base 11. So after pure white, move it up to 11% gray, 22% gray, 33, 44, and so on until you reach 99%. Now, when you apply these, consider the lighting. Of course, the light source will be white, and something that is against the light source or is blocked from the light source will be gray. And the further they are from the light, the darker their tonal value would be. So that's why in this illustration below on the left side, the character or the main character is colored gray. The character behind them is still colored gray, but it's a lighter gray. And then the monster on top is a very light gray. And then the sky is pure white. So this composition actually establishes the foreground, midground, and background. And this is very important. This allows your setting or your animation to not be a flat image. We have to imply depth. So the direction and proximity of your light also matters. Now, some of you might have or might be familiar with this example on the left, especially when it comes to your drawing 1 or drawing 2 ba yun. The direction where the light is shining from, as well as the intensity, can dictate or can even influence the story and tone. So be careful. Don't always use the Rembrandt lighting. Don't always use straight ahead lighting. Play around. Maybe the light is coming from behind them. Maybe the light is coming from under them. By moving around or by manipulating the light source, you can actually tell another layer of story. Now let's go over the do's and don'ts of animation. Do plan and thumbnail your scenes first. Generalize the scene first and then plan the flow ahead of time. When you establish a story, make sure that you already have a conclusion before you start animating. And before you start animating, make sure you've thumbnailed or did storyboard so that you won't be wasting your time planning as you animate. If you are also too technical, you will be drained out and you will get burned out. So try to balance this freedom of creativity with the following of directions. Do plot the arcs. When we say arcs, it's your arc motions. If you want to draw someone waving their hand, plot out the curve that they will be moving their hand in. This allows you to be consistent in your arcs, at the same time allow you to manipulate or control the different ways that the body can move. While it is time efficient to leave the arcs to the software, sometimes these arcs would be a bit robotic or the arc is too thin, too wide. So it's always better to step in and add in a little human touch to refine everything. Do use gesture references and don't push puppets around. What this means is once you have a drawing, use gesture references, draw them in different gestures, manipulate the motion of your character by using gesture drawing as a basis. Don't push the puppets around. Don't use puppet warp, or don't rely on puppet warp to make your character move. Of course, there will be time constraints and you will have to be forced to use puppet warp. But as a general rule of thumb, don't rely too much on puppet warp. It will distort the proportions of your drawing as well as the perspective. Do stage shots correctly. When we say this, do consider the composition, the layout, and the camera angle. Understand when the camera should be moving and when the camera should be still. If it has to move, where is it moving to? Who is it focused on as it moves? With that, don't overdo camera moves. Sometimes the story can be told properly if the camera is just still and focusing on the topic or on the subject, rather than having the camera move every 5 seconds. Last and most important is do plan timing on twos, not on ones. When you plan the way your character moves, you are saving a lot of your time. And if you plan the way your character moves through animating in twos, not only do you save time, you also save effort and resources. With that, don't think on the screen. Don't think of the motions as you animate them. Plan ahead. At the same time, if you think on the screen, you will fall victim to animating on ones. You will have this motion in mind, and you might end up animating on ones to ensure that you will get the smoothest motion possible. Now, planning on the spot, thinking of it in that way, will waste your time and your energy, and expect na ma-burn out talaga kayo at the end of it. So those are just the animation details and tips. I hope that you've learned something today, and I hope that you will apply these lessons in your 2D animation summative and also your future animation assessments. So with that, if you have any questions or concerns, do feel free to contact me, and expect a assessment to be released next week.